Ma'am, the food bank's around the corner. This is a private dining room. Kellerman, 7:30. Ja. Honey, people like you don't have reservations here. They have excuses. Ja, check the book. Ja, sir, remove her before she touches anything else. Ja, don't you put your hands on that chair. She owns the whole building. One sentence. 43 years of someone's dignity, spent in under a minute. Have you ever been told you didn't belong somewhere you already owned? 4 hours earlier, the sky over Toronto was doing what Toronto skies do in November, turning that particular shade of pewter. That means the cold isn't coming, it's already here. Sleet ticked against the window of a condominium on the 14th floor of a brick building near St. Lawrence Market. Inside, the smell of strong coffee drifted from a small kitchen, where every counter was stacked with either legal briefs or seed catalogs, sometimes both. Nora Kellerman sat at her kitchen table in a flannel shirt she'd owned since her 40s and looked at the invitation again. It was printed on cardstock the color of old cream. The Aldenvale Club, the top line read, in that font that old money uses when it wants to seem modest. Dinner in honor of the outgoing chairman. Saturday, 7:30. Black tie preferred. Nora had been to the Aldenvale once, 30 years ago, as a junior analyst accompanying her then-boss to a client dinner. She had spent the evening refilling water glasses and pretending she belonged there. She had not been back. She had not needed to be. She folded the invitation and tucked it into the breast pocket of her flannel shirt, right next to the small laminated card she'd carried every day for 11 years. It had a photograph of a farmhouse on it, 140 acres in Prince Edward County, the first piece of land she had ever bought with her own money. She carried it the way other people carry saints' medals. Nora Kellerman was 61 years old. She had been in a wheelchair since an aneurysm took the use of her legs during a board meeting in 2013, an irony she had long since stopped finding interesting. Before the aneurysm, she had been the sharpest real estate lawyer in the province. The woman developers called at midnight when deals started bleeding out. After it, she'd had 8 months of rehabilitation, a settlement from the firm that let her go quietly, and a decision to make. She made it from a hospital bed. She called her accountant, liquidated her pension, and started buying distressed commercial properties that nobody wanted. A derelict hotel in Barrie, a shuttered textile mill in Kingston, a Victorian office block in downtown Toronto that the city had been trying to offload for a decade because the elevator required updating and nobody wanted to deal with the Heritage Board. Nora dealt with the Heritage Board. She also dealt with the elevator, the roof, the plumbing, and the 3 sitting tenants who'd stopped paying rent during COVID and assumed nobody was watching. Someone was watching. Whitfield Capital, the name from the story the internet loves to tell, had nothing on what Kellerman Holdings had become. No magazine profiles, no speaking invitations. Her name lived in property records and commercial leases, and the occasional footnote in a Globe and Mail article about the Toronto real estate market. Identified as a private investor who declined to comment, bankers knew the name Kellerman Holdings. Almost none of them connected it to the woman in the chair. 3 weeks ago, in a lawyer's office on Bay Street, she'd signed the final papers on the acquisition of a 15-story mixed-use building on King Street West. The Aldenvale Club occupied the ground floor and the mezzanine. It had been operating on a lease that expired in 4 months. The new owner had not yet been announced publicly. Her grandfather had a saying, "Before you fix a house, you eat at its table." He'd meant it literally. He was a contractor who took his clients to lunch before he'd agree to any job. Nora had adapted it. Before she decided what to do with a property, she wanted to see how it behaved when it didn't know it was being watched. So she put on her second-best blazer, a navy wool one she'd bought at a Value Village in 2019 that had turned out to be a Burberry, and she rolled out into the sleet. The Aldenvale Club occupied a limestone building that had been a bank in 1907 and had never quite recovered from the ambition. Columns flanked the entrance. Brass fixtures gleamed in the November dark. A burgundy awning stretched from the door to the curb, and under it a doorman in a long coat stood with the particular posture of a man who considers umbrellas a personal service. His name was Stewart, 14 years with the club, and he was very good at his job. He opened the door for a couple in evening wear without breaking a breath. He flagged a cab for an elderly gentleman with the precision of an air traffic controller. He saw Nora coming from the bottom of the access ramp and turned away to speak into his radio. The ramp was wet. A sandwich board had been placed directly across its base, advertising the evening's prix-fixe menu. Nora stopped, gripped the board's frame, and moved it to one side, her gloved hands slipping on the wet metal. The sleet came straight in off Lake Ontario, finding every gap in her collar. By the time she reached the doors, her shoulders were burning and her gloves were soaked through. She pushed through the door herself. The warmth hit her like a hand. Inside, the Aldenvale was everything the limestone promised. Dark walnut paneling, Persian rugs so old they'd gone soft at the corners, a bar along one wall backlit amber, candles on every table close and warm. The room smelled of wood smoke and reduction sauce, and the particular cologne of men who've been members of things since birth. Behind the host stand near the entrance stood Langford. His full name was Terence Langford, and he had been the front-of-house manager at the Aldenvale for 9 years. He wore his authority the way the building wore its columns, as if it had always been there and always would be. He knew every member by name and their preferred table by memory. He knew which wines to suggest to the old money and which to suggest to the new, and he knew how to tell the difference in under 30 seconds. He clocked Nora from across the foyer. She watched his face go through 3 things in quick succession: surprise, assessment, and a decision. The decision settled into his expression like a door being locked. He did not come to meet her. He let her roll the full length of the entrance foyer, past the coat check, past the framed photographs of past chairmen, past the small bronze plaque that said members and their guests since 1902. Before he moved, and when he did move, he angled his body to block the entrance to the dining room. "Good evening." His tone had the warmth of a letter from a law firm. "I think you may have the wrong address." "I have a reservation," Nora said. "Kellerman, 7:30. He glanced down at his book. A glance, not a read. His finger didn't move on the page. "I'm not seeing that," he said. "It would be under Kellerman. Kell. I know how to spell," he said pleasantly. "Then check again." He looked at her, the blazer, the wheelchair, the wet gloves she was peeling off and folding into her jacket pocket. His chin lifted 1 degree. "Ma'am," he said, "the Aldenvale is a private members club. Reservations require a sponsoring member." "I was invited by the club itself," Nora said. "The chairman's dinner." He made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "The chairman's dinner is a black tie event for members." Nora reached into her jacket and produced the invitation. She set it on the host stand and slid it toward him. He didn't pick it up. He looked at it the way customs officers look at documents they've already decided are forged. "Anyone can have a card printed," he said. "It has the club seal on it. The seal is available online." He smiled at her, the kind of smile that is entirely teeth. "I'm sure you understand we have to be careful. We had an incident last spring. Gentleman walked in off the street, sat at a member's table, ran up a $400 bar tab. Very embarrassing for everyone." He paused. Very embarrassing. The pause was not accidental. At the bar, a man in a dinner jacket had stopped pretending to look at his phone. "Call the chairman's office," Nora said, "or the events coordinator. They'll confirm." "I'm not going to interrupt the chairman's evening over a walk-in with a printed card," he said, and his voice had dropped now, flattened to the register men use when they're sure no one important is listening. "You'll understand that our members expect a certain environment." He glanced, very briefly, at her wheels. "I can recommend several restaurants in the neighborhood that would be better suited." Several restaurants in the neighborhood. The words went out into the room and stayed there. At the bar, a young woman named Petra Voss stopped polishing glasses. She'd been bartending at the Aldenvale for 2 years. working her way through a business degree at Ryerson, the night shifts paying her rent, the tips paying her tuition. She had watched Langford sort people at that stand for every one of those 2 years. She knew the vocabulary. She knew what neighborhood meant when he said it like that. She set down her cloth. She poured a glass of water, walked around the bar, and set it quietly on the ledge of the host's stand at the height Nora could reach. "Cold out there," she said simply. Nora looked at her. "Thank you, Petra," Langford said, her name in his mouth like a warning. "She's not bothering anyone. Back to the bar. Now." Petra held his gaze for a moment. 1 second, maybe 2, then went. But she went to the end of the bar, not the back, and her phone was in her hand. Nora took the water. She looked at Langford over the rim of the glass. "Your name," she said. He blinked. "For my records, your full name." He straightened. "Terence Langford, front of house manager, 9 years with this club." He said it the way Candace had said Puit, 2 T's. As a credential, a shield, write it wherever you like. Nora set the glass down. "Spelling matters," she said, "especially on leases." Something moved behind his eyes. He buried it. He turned to the man who had appeared at his elbow, a security contractor named Roland, who worked weekend evenings and whose job had never included anything more dramatic than a member who'd had too much at the bar. Roland was a large man and uncomfortable. "Sir," Langford said quietly, "if you'll escort this woman out." Roland looked at Nora. She was sitting very still, her hands on her wheels, her expression doing nothing in particular. He had seen genuine disturbances. He had seen people who were trouble. He was not looking at one. "Ma'am," he said, "I'm going to need to ask you." "Stop." The word came from across the room, from the direction of the private dining area, and the man it came from was walking fast. Not quite running. The kind of fast that has left dignity somewhere behind it and is hoping nobody noticed. His name was Clifford O.C. Mensa, and he was the Aldenvale's general counsel, which meant he dealt with everything the club didn't want to become a lawsuit. He had been called out of the chairman's dinner 30 seconds ago by an assistant who had received a text from the bartender. He had pulled up Kellerman Holdings on his phone while walking down the hallway and had arrived at the host stand with the color gone from his face. "Don't," he said. "Roland, don't touch that chair." He stepped between Roland and Nora and turned to face her, and whatever composure he had walked in with, he spent all of it on keeping his voice level. "Miss Kellerman." He straightened his jacket. We had no idea you were coming this evening." "We weren't informed," she said it very quietly. No one was supposed to be informed. He absorbed that. He had the look of a man doing fast arithmetic on a very bad spreadsheet. Langford had not moved. His face was doing something complicated. The expression of a man watching a floor open under him and still hoping it's a trick of the light. "The invitation," Clifford said to him. "Did you look at it?" "I assessed the—" "Did you look at it?" Langford looked at the invitation, still on the host stand, still face up. He picked it up, and this time he read it, and the blood went out of his face the way water goes out of a glass that's been knocked sideways. The chairman's dinner invitation had been issued by the club itself. In the bottom left corner, in smaller type that Langford had not read, it said, "In recognition of the incoming majority leaseholder, Kellerman Holdings, Inc., and the continued partnership of this institution, majority leaseholder." Clifford turned to the dining room and raised his voice just enough. "Ladies and gentlemen." He waited for heads to turn. "I'd like to introduce Nora Kellerman, principal of Kellerman Holdings. As of 3 weeks ago, the owner of this building." The room did the thing rooms do when the coordinates of power shift suddenly. Glasses stopped moving. Chairs turned. A man near the window put down his fork. The chairman, a silver-haired man named Douglas Wren, who had spent 40 years building the Aldenvale into what it was, came around the table with the expression of a man who has just watched his life's work be embarrassed in 40 seconds. "Douglas." Nora met him halfway. "I don't want to interrupt the evening." "Nora." He took her hand. His voice was steady, but his eyes were not. "I owe you an apology that I don't have the right words for yet." "You don't owe me an apology." She looked past him, across the room. "Your club does." Upstairs, or rather 2 minutes earlier at the private bar off the dining room, the thing that saved the evening, or rather, began saving it, had been Petra's text message to the assistant who had Clifford's number. 3 sentences. Woman in wheelchair at front. Says she has a reservation. Langford's making it bad. Clifford had read the first 2 words of Kellerman Holdings on his phone and left his drink on the bar. Now he stood beside Langford at the host stand, and neither of them was speaking. Nora rolled toward the host stand one more time. She stopped. She looked at the sandwich board that was still leaning against the wall where she'd moved it, the one that had been sitting across the bottom of the access ramp in the sleet. That board, she said to Clifford. Where does it usually live? He followed her gaze. His jaw moved. On the ramp, apparently. She nodded once. That's item 1. She looked at Roland. He was standing very still, his hands at his sides. She looked at him the way she'd looked at Dennis in the original story, not at Langford, at him. What's your name? Roland Ferris. Ma'am. Roland, I want you to know I understand you were doing your job as you were told to do it. She let that sit for a moment. And I want you to remember that you didn't touch the chair, even when you were asked to. That will matter. Roland Ferris would tell that story at his kitchen table for 10 years. Langford had found his voice. He turned to Douglas Wren. Sir, I followed club protocol. There's no way I could have known. Douglas looked at him. Terence, she asked you to make 1 phone call. The dining room had gone very quiet. 43 people, most of them members of the Aldenville for decades, were listening to a man explain why he had not made a phone call. There was no good answer to that. There never is. Nora said, I'd like to go in to dinner now. She looked at Douglas. If the invitation still stands. It stands, he said, and more than stands. She rolled past the host stand. At the bar, Petra was restacking glasses with great attention to detail and trying not to smile. Nora stopped beside her. Petra. She had remembered the name from the nameplate. What are you studying? Business administration, ma'am. Where? Ryerson. She paused. Toronto Metropolitan now. Nora nodded. Come see me when you're done. She handed her a card. Plain white, Kellerman Holdings. A phone number. Not the one that went to the assistant. The direct line. I could use someone who knows when to send a text. Petra looked at the card for a long moment. Then she tucked it into her apron. Dinner was served at 8 o'clock. Nora sat at the chairman's right hand, at a table that had a view of the entire room, and she ate the duck confit and drank the burgundy and listened to Douglas Wren talk about what he'd built for 40 years. She liked him. He was not Langford. He was a man who had built something and cared about it, and what happened in his foyer that evening had genuinely broken something in him. The worst of it, he said quietly, over dessert, is that I know it happens. Not just tonight. I know it happens and I don't. He stopped. I look the other way because the complaints are quiet and the people who make them don't come back. And so there's nothing to fix because no one is there to fix it. She let that sit. The person who got turned away, she said, usually doesn't come back. That's the whole design, isn't it? The discomfort is the point. You make it uncomfortable enough and the problem solves of itself because the person leaves. He was quiet. I was the person who left, she said. 30 years ago. First time I came here, I was the junior analyst carrying someone else's briefcase, and your coat check attendant asked me if I was with the catering staff. I smiled and said no, and spent the evening making myself small, and 30 years later I bought your building. She smiled, without warmth and without cruelty. That's not a threat, it's just what happened. Douglas Wren looked at his dessert plate for a long time. Clifford had left the dining room 20 minutes in to begin what would be a very thorough internal review. He was a careful lawyer and he had already understood, from the moment he'd pulled up Kellerman Holdings on his phone, that the footage from the foyer cameras was going to matter. He requested it at 9 o'clock. By 10, he and Douglas were watching it in a small office off the lobby, and by 10:15, Douglas Wren had aged 5 years. The camera above the host stand was high definition. It had audio. Every word Langford had said was on it, flat and clear and inarguable. Several restaurants in the neighborhood that would be better suited. The glance at the wheels. The sandwich board, visible in the corner of the frame, leaning against the wall where Nora had already moved it. Douglas made 2 calls before midnight. One to the club's HR firm, one to Nora. "I've seen the footage," she said. "I assumed you would," she said. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything tonight," she said. "Do it properly. Take your time. I'm not going anywhere." "Technically," she added, "I own the building." There was a pause, and then Douglas Wren laughed, a short, exhausted, real laugh, and she thought that laugh might be the beginning of something. The review took 11 days. What it found was not a surprise to anyone who looked. 4 formal complaints against Langford in 6 years. 3 guests turned away from the door on grounds that shifted in the paperwork. Once a dress code issue that wasn't. Once a reservation that had been logged and then quietly unmarked. Once a private event that wasn't private at all. A service dog denied entry in 2021 on the grounds of a member's allergy that medical records later couldn't confirm. And 18 disciplinary write-ups against Petra Voss. For extending service to guests Langford had marked as inappropriate, for pouring a glass of water for someone who was waiting too long, for once offering to call a cab for a man who was unwell and had not asked for one. Every write-up dated within 3 days of an act of ordinary decency. The pattern was as clear as the camera footage, and just as hard to watch. Langford was terminated for cause on a Tuesday. He cleaned out his locker while the temp watered the arrangements at the host stand. No public announcement. Nora had been specific. Process, not performance. The consequences were real enough without needing an audience. They were real. The agency that placed him with the Aldenvale asked him not to return his calls when 2 of their biggest clients called asking about him. His reference, which had previously been impeccable, now had a gap in it shaped like a camera with audio. Some gaps are very loud. He gave an interview 3 weeks later to a hospitality industry newsletter. He had been scapegoated, he said. He had followed the club's protocols. The real issue was a rush to judgment driven by social media pressure, and he had been, in his view, the only one in the situation who was doing his actual job. The clip of him saying, "We weren't informed who she was," had already been shared 15,000 times by then. The newsletter published the interview anyway. The comment section was not kind. Nora was asked twice if she intended to pursue a human rights complaint. She declined, both times, for the same reason. "A complaint gets me an apology in writing," she told Clifford. "I have the building. I can get something better than an apology." What she got was the Aldenvale First Impressions Initiative, funded with $180,000 from Kellerman Holdings' first year of lease revenue and another $120,000 from the club itself. Douglas Wren co-chaired it. His name went first because Nora didn't need her name on the letterhead, and because she wanted the membership to know this was their chair doing the work, not an outside force doing it to them. Every front-of-house staff member retrained, not a module. Actual people, people with mobility aids, people with service animals, people whose first language wasn't English, people who showed up in thrift store blazers. Sitting across a table and talking for an hour about what they'd needed when they walked through a door and what they'd gotten instead. The access ramp was redesigned, heated. The sandwich board policy was eliminated. All A-frame signage moved inside. The host stand was lowered on one side. The coat check attendant who'd asked the junior analyst if she was catering 30 years ago had retired in 2009. There was nothing to be done about that. But the woman hired to run the new front-of-house training program was 24, the daughter of Somali immigrants, and had never belonged to anything in her life. Her name was Amara Hersey, and she was finishing a hospitality management degree. And she ran the training sessions with the particular authority of someone who had needed someone to hold the door open for them, and had spent years learning how to hold it for others instead. Roland Ferris was retained. The review board noted that he had been directed to act by a superior and had not ultimately acted, that he had heard stop and stopped. He was given up-to-date training. He became the person who tells the new security contractors the story on their first shift. Treat everyone, he tells them, like they might own the building. You will be wrong about most of them. You will never regret it. Petra finished her degree in April. She started the following Monday as the Alden Cole's first director of guest experience, at a salary that made her mother sit down on the kitchen floor and cry a little. Her first official act was commissioning a photograph for the wall behind the host stand. It showed a glass of water on a mahogany bar. That was all. No caption. The membership understood what it meant. New members were told. Nora didn't frame the photograph she kept of the evening. She didn't frame anything. She kept the original invitation, the one Langford had looked at without reading, in a small wooden box on her kitchen table next to the laminated photograph of the farmhouse in Prince Edward County. She had added one thing to the box: a copy of the lease. Kellerman Holdings, majority leaseholder. Signed 3 weeks before she'd rolled through those doors in a second-hand Burberry in the sleet. She told one interviewer, the only one she'd agreed to 6 months later, "What happened to me that night happens to somebody every single day, in this city and every city. The only thing unusual about my evening was that I happened to own the floor he was standing on. I couldn't fix the 30 years before it. I could fix the floor." The sandwich board ended up in a storage room in the building's basement. Someone from facilities found it 3 months later and brought it to Nora's office, not knowing what else to do with it. She kept it. It stands in the corner behind her desk, facing the wall. It says on the side, "Nobody can read anymore. Fine dining. Prefix. By reservation only." She has not changed a word of it. She doesn't need to. Okay, I want to be honest with you for a minute. I tell stories about moments like this one because I think we misunderstand what justice looks like. We want the dramatic firing, the viral clip, the villain walked out in handcuffs. And sometimes that happens. But the thing I keep coming back to is the sandwich board on the ramp. Nobody put it there to be cruel. Somebody just didn't think. Didn't think about who would need that ramp. Didn't think about what it cost the person who had to move it in the sleet before they'd even gotten through the door. Most of the cruelty in the world isn't Langford sneering at the host stand. It's a sandwich board. It's a host stand built at a height that makes you invisible. It's a phone call nobody made because it wasn't their problem. Nora Kellerman didn't fix Langford. You can't fix Langford. What she fixed was the building. And that matters, because the next person who comes through that door in a second-hand blazer in the sleet won't have to move anything to get inside. If you had been standing in that foyer at 7:30, before anyone knew her name, what would you have done? Not what you wish you would have done. What would you have actually done? I read every comment. The honest answers are the ones I remember. If this one stayed with you, share it with someone who needs the reminder. And subscribe, because there are more stories like this one waiting to be told, true to life in all the ways that matter. Until next time, check the ramp before you open the door.